On Sunday, May 31st, 1970, at exactly 3:23 p.m., the ground beneath Yungay, Peru began to shake. For 45 seconds, the earth convulsed. Adobe buildings crumbled. Dust filled the streets. Then the shaking stopped. 20,000 people were in and around the city that afternoon. Residents, market visitors, farmers who had come in from surrounding villages. They stumbled outside, checking on neighbors, pulling survivors from rubble. They believed they had just survived the worst of it. They had no idea that 18,000 feet above them, a mass of glacial ice and fractured rock, roughly 900 meters wide and 1.6 kilometers long, had already detached from Mount Huascarán's north peak. The mountain was falling. They had less than 3 minutes. By 3:27 p.m., the city would be buried under debris, moving at speeds of up to 280 kilometers per hour. Despite the 200-meter wall of solid rock that had been identified as Yungay's natural shield, the barrier didn't stop the avalanche. It redirected it directly over the city. 4 minutes, tens of thousands of lives. And a physics lesson, the warning had already been written. Yungay sat in the Callejón de Huaylas, an Andean valley carved between two parallel mountain ranges. To the west, Cordillera Negra. To the east, the snow-covered Cordillera Blanca, the highest tropical mountain range on Earth. Mount Huascarán's twin peaks rose to 6,768 meters above sea level. The city occupied the valley floor roughly 15 kilometers from the mountain's base. That afternoon, close to 20,000 people were present in and around the city. The permanent population was several thousand. The rest had come in for the Sunday market, for church, for the kind of ordinary Sunday activity that concentrates people in a city center. The land was fertile. Water flowed from mountain runoff year-round. Families had occupied these streets since the colonial period. Between the city and the mountain stood Cerro de Aira, a rock ridge rising approximately 200 meters above the valley floor, the equivalent of a 65-story building, solid bedrock. It had stood through every event in recorded memory. To the residents of Yungay, this ridge was more than a geological feature. Any avalanche from Huascarán's northwest face would be blocked. The Peruvian government had conducted assessments. Officials had issued formal statements. Yungay was declared safe. The protection was guaranteed. The valley produced crops, tourism, brought revenue, and evacuating would economically destroy the region over a threat that had never materialized within living memory. The confidence was institutional, generational, and absolute. The false security rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of how mountains move at catastrophic scale. Rock seems solid. Glaciers seem static. Barriers seem permanent, but at sufficient velocity, with sufficient mass, the rules change. Friction disappears, solid becomes liquid, shields become ramps. The geology that would prove all of it wrong was already fractured and waiting 18,000 feet above the valley, and had been for 8 years, since 2 American researchers identified it and watched their warning get deliberately buried by the same government that had guaranteed the city's safety. 8 years before the mountain fell, it gave a warning. On January 10, 1962, an avalanche broke from Huascarán's north peak. Approximately 13 million cubic meters of ice and rock accelerated down the eastern slope. The mass traveled the distance in under 4 minutes. More than 4,000 people died. The town of Ranramjirka was essentially erased. Yungay, positioned on a different drainage path and protected by Cerro de Aira, remained untouched. The avalanche appeared to validate the city's geography. The ridge had held. The protection appeared real. But the 1962 event demonstrated something critical. Huascarán was actively unstable. The mountain wasn't a static monument. It was a dynamic system of fractured granite and moving ice. The Peruvian government commissioned geological surveys in the aftermath. In September 1962, a glaciological expedition sponsored by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology arrived to assess the mountain's northwest face, the side directly above Yungay. The team included American climbers and scientists David Bernay and Charles Sawyer. What they found was unambiguous. A massive vertical slab of rock was being actively undermined by Glacier 511. The overhanging cliff reached as high as 1,000 meters in places. The rock was described as pervasively fractured, not a single stable mass, but a collection of enormous fragments held in temporary equilibrium by friction and ice. Bernay and Sawyer calculated the implications. If a sufficiently large avalanche detached from this face, it would be large enough to spill over Cerro de Ara and reach Yungay directly. Their findings were published on September 27, 1962, in the Lima newspaper El Expreso under the headline, "Dantesque Avalanche Threatens Yungay." The Peruvian government's response was immediate. According to Sawyer, officials ordered them to retract the report or face prison. The two researchers fled the country. Citizens in the region were actively prevented from discussing the threat. The calculation was institutional. Declaring Yungay a hazard zone would trigger economic collapse. Tourism would cease, and thousands of people would require relocation with no resources to support them. The researchers were predicting a possibility, not a certainty, and evacuating on probabilistic modeling was judged politically unacceptable. This is the recurring pattern in disaster history: short-term political calculation overriding long-term safety. The warnings exist. The science is clear. The institutions choose silence. Between 1962 and 1970, no public warning system was established in Yungay. No evacuation drills were conducted. No geological monitoring was installed. The fractured mass remained on the mountain, held in place by ice and friction, waiting for sufficient force to overcome the temporary equilibrium. The residents of Yungay continued building lives in the valley, trusting the rock wall they could see and the government assessments they were told to believe. They had no access to the suppressed findings that had already identified their city as the destination of the next large collapse. On Sunday, May 31, 1970, at 3:23 p.m., the earthquake provided exactly the force Bernay and Sawyer had warned about. The 45 seconds of sustained shaking turned small fractures into catastrophic structural failure. The granite mass detached. The prediction made 8 years earlier began moving toward the city that was never warned. The earthquake began at 3:23 p.m. local time, magnitude 7.9. Epicenter, 35 kilometers offshore west of Chimbote at a depth of approximately 15 kilometers, shallow enough to amplify ground shaking across the entire Andean coast. Most destructive earthquakes last 10 to 20 seconds. This one lasted 45. The extended duration provided sustained force rather than a single shock. Each second further fractured already weakened granite, propagating small cracks into large fissures until the accumulated damage exceeded the threshold that friction and ice could hold. In Yungay, the shaking was violent enough to collapse heavy adobe roofs. Buildings pancaked, the streets filled with blinding dust. People stumbled outside, disoriented, checking for injuries, calling for family members. When the shaking stopped, there was a moment of relief. The earthquake damage was severe, but survivable. The people present believed they had just survived the worst disaster of their lives. Then the sound came, described by survivors as thousands of locomotives, or continuous thunder, or a roar that seemed to come from the sky rather than the ground. Survivor Mateo Casaverde, who had just stepped out of a car on the road between Yungay and the neighboring town of Caraz, heard the distinct deep rumble from the direction of Huascarán at approximately 3:24. He ran for the cemetery hill. He made it. At the mountain, approximately 30 seconds into the earthquake, the fractured granite mass tore loose. The detachment involved both rock and glacial ice, a sliding mass roughly 910 meters wide and 1.6 kilometers long. The initial volume was approximately 265 million cubic feet of rock and ice, the equivalent of 7 Empire State Buildings. The initial movement was a collapse. Gravity took over. The mass began accelerating down the slope. The time between the earthquake ending and the avalanche arriving in Yungay was approximately 2 to 3 minutes. This brief window created the cruelest scenarios. People who might have run to high ground instead remained to help earthquake victims trapped in rubble. Others ran toward the city center searching for family members, directly into the path of what was coming. Some hesitated, confused by the sound, unable to locate the threat. The few who survived made the decision to run upward in the first seconds after hearing the roar. There was no time for deliberation, no time to retrieve possessions or confirm the danger. The people who paused to assess the situation did not survive. As the mass descended, survivors on higher ground reported a visible dust cloud rising above the mountain. The temperature dropped suddenly. A freezing wind arrived ahead of the debris. Compressed air pushed forward by the advancing mass, carrying fine ice particles and pulverized rock. The avalanche wasn't behaving like falling rock. The friction of an enormous mass grinding down the slope generated heat sufficient to melt glacial ice instantly. Solid ice became liquid water. The water mixed with pulverized granite and soil, creating a slurry. The mass transformed from solid to liquid. It stopped moving like a landslide and began hydroplaning on its own meltwater, a process geologists classify as a sturstrom, a rock avalanche that undergoes fluidization. Friction, the force that normally slows such events, effectively disappeared. At 3:26 p.m., the avalanche reached Cerro de Aira. The 200-meter ridge didn't stop it. The hydroplaning effect had reduced friction to near zero. The mass was following a ballistic trajectory. When it struck the angled rock face, physics redirected the momentum upward. The ridge functioned as a launch ramp. The avalanche vaulted over the barrier and became airborne. It landed directly on Yungay. The preceding air blast arrived first, powerful enough to strip roofs and throw vehicles. Then the main mass, rock, ice, mud, moving at speeds estimated between 175 and 280 kilometers per hour, burying structures in seconds. The mixture behaved like wet concrete, filling every space, crushing everything, then beginning to solidify as the churning stopped. By 3:27 p.m., 4 minutes after the earthquake began, the city of Yungay no longer existed above ground. The avalanche covered approximately 15 square kilometers. Burial depth at the central plaza reached roughly 5 meters, with deeper deposits of up to 20 meters in some areas. The density and speed of deposition made excavation futile. There were no bodies to recover, no ruins to salvage. The 4 palm trees that had lined the central plaza survived because their flexible trunks bent rather than snapped under the blast. They remain standing today, half buried, the only visible evidence marking where the city center once existed. Survivors on the cemetery hill, elevated roughly 30 meters above the valley floor, on what turned out to be a pre-Inca burial mound, watched the flow sweep past below them. They reported being knocked down by the wind blast. The roar was deafening. The dust cloud obscured everything. When it cleared, the city was gone. The earthquake itself killed approximately 66,000 to 70,000 people across a 400-kilometer stretch of the Peruvian coast. Yungay accounted for roughly 18,000 to 20,000 of that total, not from the shaking, but from the 4-minute consequence of the shaking that 2 researchers had predicted with geographic precision 8 years earlier. The mountain had moved. The suppressed warning had become the disaster that was inevitable. As the mass tore loose between 5,500 and 6,500 meters of elevation, it incorporated everything in its path: additional ice, fractured bedrock, soil, glacial lake water. The initial detachment expanded rapidly as it descended, picking up material from the slope below. The transformation occurred within the first 30 seconds. The friction of the mass grinding across rock generated temperatures high enough to melt glacial ice instantly. Solid ice became liquid water, mixing with pulverized granite to create a slurry. The meltwater created a lubricating layer beneath the main mass, and friction effectively disappeared. As it descended, the mass gorged on additional boulders and glacial lakes, expanding from its initial 265 million cubic feet to an estimated 3.5 billion cubic feet by the time it reached the valley. Enough to bury all of Manhattan under 5 feet of solid rock in under 4 minutes. Speed estimates calculated from the distance traveled and time elapsed indicate the avalanche reached average speeds of 175 to 210 miles per hour, with peak velocity exceeding 280 miles per hour, faster than an Indy car at full throttle. At those velocities, the air ahead of the mass was compressed into a pressure wave, a blast of wind that arrived seconds before the debris itself and was powerful enough to overturn vehicles and strip roofs. Cerro de Aira was never going to stop it. The ridge stood 200 meters tall, solid bedrock, immovable on human timescales. But when a mass of this scale, moving at these speeds on a near frictionless base, encounters an angled surface, the barrier doesn't absorb the momentum. It redirects it. The sloped rock face functioned as a ramp. The trajectory angled upward. The mass became airborne, vaulting over the ridge, clearing a structure equivalent to a 65-story building, and landed directly on the city below. At those speeds, the debris didn't pile up gradually. It slammed down, filling every space in seconds, burying structures under meters of material before anyone inside could react. The mixture of mud, pulverized rock, and ice behaved like wet concrete, fluid enough to flow into every gap, dense enough to crush anything it contacted, and quick setting as the churning stopped. The transformation from solid to liquid, the elimination of friction, the ballistic trajectory, turned the protective ridge into the mechanism of the city's destruction. The government guarantee of safety had been based on static geology, a rock wall blocking falling debris. The avalanche wasn't falling in any conventional sense. It was flying. Out of roughly 20,000 people present in and around Yungay that afternoon, approximately 400 survived. 92 of them survived by reaching the cemetery. Campo Santo occupied an artificial mound on the southern edge of the city, built as it happened on top of a pre-Inca burial structure that may be as old as 10,000 years. The mound elevated the cemetery roughly 30 meters above the valley floor. In geographic terms, that elevation was negligible, but the avalanche's main trajectory followed the valley floor. The cemetery stood just beyond the edge of the primary flow path. Survival required making one decision in the 2-minute window between hearing the roar and the debris arriving, run upward. The people who survived weren't necessarily faster or smarter. Many were simply closer to the cemetery when the sound began. Others ran on instinct, upward, away from the noise, without fully understanding what was coming. Survivor accounts describe a low, distinct rumble from the direction of Huascarán, recognizably different from the earthquake, arriving roughly a minute after the shaking stopped. Some who had experienced the 1962 avalanche in neighboring towns recognized the sound. Most didn't think. They just moved. The people who hesitated didn't make it. The people who ran toward the city center to find family members didn't make it. Survival was not earned. It was positional. The other approximately 300 survivors were children. A circus had been performing at the town stadium, positioned on higher ground at the edge of the city. Accounts describe a clown, known locally as Cucarita, leading the children away from the tent toward higher ground immediately after the shaking stopped. What is confirmed is that approximately 300 children at the stadium survived, and the stadium's elevation placed them just outside the primary flow path. The children watched the avalanche bury the city below them. Most of them watched it bury their homes. The majority watched it bury their parents. The randomness is the thing. There's no narrative of earned survival, no universal story of preparation or quick thinking that separated the living from the dead. It came down to where you were standing when the roar started. Some survivors were saved by delays earlier in the day, a missed bus, a conversation that ran long, an errand that kept them outside the city center at 3:23. A 2-minute delay that morning became a 30-meter elevation difference at 3:27 p.m. The survivors on the cemetery hill reported being knocked down by the air blast, cold, abrasive with ice particles strong enough to strip tree branches. Then the debris arrived as a wall. When the dust cleared, the city was gone. Not damaged, not collapsed, gone. Erased under meters of gray-brown debris stretching across the entire valley floor. The survivors could see the 4 palm trees still standing at the buried plaza. Nothing else remained above ground. Rescue attempts began immediately, but proved futile within hours. The debris had consolidated into a dense matrix, compressed by its own weight, hardened as the churning stopped. Excavation equipment couldn't penetrate to meaningful depth. The risk of secondary collapse made sustained digging operations too dangerous. The destruction did not stop at Yungay's edge. The volume of debris that poured into the valley was sufficient to dam the Rio Santa, the river running through the Callejón de Huaylas. The dam held for a period, backing water up behind it, before eventually giving way. The resulting surge traveled more than 100 miles down the valley, destroying farms, villages, roads, and a diversion dam feeding a hydroelectric facility. The avalanche that buried Yungay in 4 minutes continued killing downstream for hours. Roughly 18,000 to 20,000 people were under there. No bodies could be recovered, no individual graves could be marked. The city had become a mass grave by default. The aftermath produced a final bureaucratic dimension. The avalanche had buried the civil registry building along with everything else. Birth certificates, property deeds, marriage records, all legal documentation of existence gone. Survivors found themselves legally erased. Many spent years in court proceedings simply to prove they had been residents, that they were who they claimed to be, that they were alive. The mountain killed the city in 4 minutes. The paperwork took years to finish the job. The Peruvian government eventually declared the 246 acres covering the former city a national cemetery. Excavation legally prohibited, rebuilding banned, the site sealed as a permanent mass grave. The decision solved an impossible problem. No feasible way to recover thousands of bodies under meters of consolidated debris, and no way to identify remains even if they could be reached. A new city, Yungay Nuevo, was built approximately 1 kilometer north on higher ground. The survivors relocated. Life continued in the technical sense. The 1970 Yungay Avalanche remains the deadliest in recorded history. The same government institution that suppressed the 1962 findings signed the paperwork declaring the city a permanent tomb. The guarantee of safety and the acknowledgement of total loss from the same bureaucratic authority, separated by 8 years and roughly 20,000 lives. The ridge's failure requires its own examination. The protective barrier assessment had been based on a reasonable assumption that an avalanche descending from Huascarán would be subject to ground-level friction and deceleration, and a 200-meter wall of bedrock would arrest or divert it. That assumption was wrong in a specific documented way. Sturstrom behavior, fluidization through frictional heating, was understood in the geological literature by 1962. When Bernay and Sawyer assessed the North Peak, the implication was explicit. An avalanche of sufficient size would not behave like ordinary falling debris. It would hydroplane. A ridge that stops a conventional avalanche becomes a ramp for a ballistic one. The distinction matters because it means the ridge's failure wasn't a geological surprise. It was a physical consequence that the suppressed 1962 report had anticipated. The government didn't just suppress the warning. It suppressed the specific mechanism by which the protection it was guaranteeing would fail. At Cerro de Ira, the avalanche struck the ridgeline and the angled rock surface redirected its momentum upward. The mass became airborne. It cleared the ridge and descended on the city below, with boulders weighing thousands of metric tons deposited across the valley floor. The protection that had stood for millennia, that had held through the 1962 event and every event before it, became the final instrument of the city's burial. This is the particular cruelty of the Yungay disaster. Every physical feature that gave the city its sense of security participated in the mechanism of destruction. The mountain's distance gave the avalanche room to accelerate. The valley geometry concentrated the flow. The ridge redirected it directly overhead. And the Callejón de Huaylas had been warning anyone who looked. A large avalanche in 1725 buried the colonial city of Ancash. The 1962 event killed 4,000 people in Ranrahirca. The mountain had been demonstrating its instability for centuries. The difference in 1970 was not the geology, it was the suppression of the people who could read it. Today, 4 palm trees still stand where Yungay's plaza once existed, half-buried, upright, visible from the path that visitors walk through what is now called Campo Santo, the Holy Field. A Christ statue on the cemetery hill faces the mountain with its arms outstretched. The 4 palm trees are the most photographed symbol of the disaster. They were the only part of the city center flexible enough to survive what hit it. The debris field is a permanent mass grave, legally sealed. A new city stands a kilometer north. The 400 who survived rebuilt it, and their children and grandchildren live there now. The suppressed 1962 report was specific. A sufficiently large avalanche from Huascarán's North Peak would spill over Cerro de Ira and reach Yungay. The government that buried that finding signed the paperwork in 1977, declaring the city a permanent cemetery. The mountain moved exactly as the researchers said it would. The ridge failed exactly as the physics required. The only variable that could have changed the outcome was the decision, made 8 years before the earthquake, to make sure no one in Yungay ever heard the warning. The avalanche path is still visible from above, a gray scar cutting through the green valley, marking where a mountain became liquid and a city disappeared in 4 minutes. The evidence is immovable. The warning is permanent. The city is still down there,